Well, welcome everyone. On behalf of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, I'd like to thank you all for joining us on day 3 of the Australian Disaster Resilience Conference Presents Knowledge Week. My name is Marie Grenfell and I lead the City Resilience team, Resilient Melbourne, at the City of Melbourne. And I'm also a member of this year's conference program committee. I thoroughly enjoyed meeting many of you yesterday afternoon at the launch of the Australian Disaster Resilience Network. More than ever, it is so important to connect with each other, to support each other's work, and to learn and share our knowledge from each other, and also our skills and experience so that we can collectively build resilience across Australia. Please join our LinkedIn group to get involved. This afternoon's sessions fall under the theme of community creating change, and I'm delighted to be your host. So this afternoon, I acknowledge that I am hosting this conference from the lands of the Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us from today, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this conference. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people, their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters across Australia. So just a few housekeeping notes. Please share your conference experience on Twitter using AIDRC20, hashtag of course, and be sure to check out the virtual posters via the hashtag AIDRC20 poster as well. So a few people are having issues viewing some of the PowerPoint slides if you're joining through a browser rather than through the Zoom app itself. So if you have any trouble, you'll find a PDF copy of today's program, of today's presentation on the program page, along with speaker bios and the presentation outlines. The AIDA team will also share this link in the chat window. We're using the Q&A function, which I'm sure many of you are now very familiar with, for questions. So I really invite you to keep your questions and votes coming throughout the presentation today. We're going to have time for Q&A at the conclusion of the presentations. So now I'd like to welcome our first presenters this afternoon, Brigid Little from AIDR, Will Mezner from World Vision, and Natalie Dajkovich from Oaktree and Ashley Wild from Monash University. Who'll be presenting Turning Up the Volume, Young Australian Voices on Climate Change and Disaster Risk. There's going to be 5 minutes at the end of the presentation for your questions, and I encourage you all to please ask your questions using the Q&A function in the box at the bottom of your screen as soon as you think of them. Something comes to mind. Don't sit on your questions. Look forward to what you would like to ask of these presenters. So over to you, Brigid, Will, Natalie and Ashley. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marie. Welcome everyone. I'm Brigid Little from AIDR, and our presentation today is Turning Up the Volume, Young Australian Voices on Climate Change and Disaster Risk.
Thanks, Brigid. I'd like to start by acknowledging country. We meet on the country of many First Nations people across Australia. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and there is very much for us to learn who've come new to these lands from the traditional custodians who've lived with these lands and waters for 60,000 years. And we acknowledge any elders past and present and any Indigenous people who are here with us today. So my name's Will, I'm from World Vision Australia, and we believe that children have the right to participate in disaster risk reduction conversations. It says so in Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, it says children and youth are agents of change and should be given the space and modalities to contribute to disaster risk reduction in accordance with legislation, national practice, and education curricula. It's everyone's responsibility to bring children and young people to the table. And so ahead of the APMCDRR, the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, which was to have happened in Brisbane this year, a number of organisations across the Asia Pacific surveyed over 7,000 people, and we in Australia formed a coalition with World Vision, Save the Children, UNICEF, Oaktree, Plan, Red Cross, and the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience to survey 1,500 young Australians. That's the basis of the report that we're going to be presenting today. As a part of the analysis for this survey, 80 young people applied to be on a youth advisory panel, and two of the successful applicants who helped to analyse the data for the report are with us today, Ashley and Natalie. I'll throw over to you, Brigid, to talk about AIDR's contribution.
Yeah, thanks very much, Will. So AIDR's involvement in this survey design, implementation and report took place from a certain point last year. It was obviously we felt that this survey was going to be very relevant to our education program for disaster resilience education, and our network focused this year on youth voice and participation. AIDR was planning to be involved in leading some of the youth-focused events at the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference, which unfortunately didn't take place. But we changed tack, and we've been working closely with World Vision, particularly around the youth panel selection and workshops, and then the development of the report. I just want to note at this point that we were so impressed with the quality of applications for the youth panel. We had applications from all over Australia, young people who were very passionate about climate change in particular, and also disaster risk, and young people who are very well informed about relevant issues and really keen to be heard by decision makers. I'm going to pass over to two of those young people now, and that's Natalie and Ashley.
Thanks so much, Brigid, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ashley, and I was on the panel that analysed the survey data along with Natalie here. I study geographical science, applied maths, and international development at Monash Uni. For me, disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation are key areas for resilience and empowerment into the future. So I come into this from a scientific and academic perspective, more so than from lived experience. And here's Natalie.
Hi everyone. So as Ashley said, I was also a part of the panel that was analysing the survey results. My background is really in environmental policy and environmental economics in particular. So I did a Bachelor of Politics, Philosophy and Economics at the Australian National University. And I'm currently doing my thesis in international carbon pricing. And I also work for the government in environmental economics and policy. So I suppose what I'm really interested in are policy as well as government responses to climate change, and the extent to which I suppose specific voices are represented and sufficiently heard within the decision-making space in Australia. So in terms of the next slide, I'd really like to read some of the responses from our decision makers and from some of the young people that contributed to this survey. So if everyone can see that clearly, I'll just read out this quote, which was from one of the young people that contributed to this survey. And it says, the bushfires this summer in Australia were horrific. These catastrophic disasters aren't going to stop. In fact, they are only going to get worse as time progresses without action being taken. It is the responsibility of every single person to do everything they can to reduce the impact of climate change. Everyday people are trying their hardest to do their best, but until huge corporations and governments all around the world take action, this crisis will only get worse. Responsibility to fix this global crisis is falling upon youth, because we are the ones growing up with this as our reality. It makes me angry. It makes me anxious. I am tired of being angry and anxious about this huge problem, especially when I feel so small and powerless. Please do something. And I think this quote is really lovely because I think that it highlights, I suppose, the emotional aspect of climate change as well, particularly for young people who are sort of growing up with this being the rest of their lives and kind of seeing where they're going to fit into it and what they're going to personally do about these issues. And so now I'd like to hand over to Ashley, who'll begin to analyse some of the survey results of the report itself.
Thank you. And so, as I'm sure we all know, climate change adaptation is so much more than infrastructure. It's adapting our way of life for the new circumstance. and that includes modifying our curriculums and education. Next slide, please. Here are the top 10 hazards that our participants learnt about at school. If you want to see the full list though, you'll have to read the report, sorry. You can see that more than 2/3 of young people have learnt about earthquakes, bushfires, and floods. All three of these are fascinating and devastating phenomena that reveal more about the nature of the world. Though if we consider education from a safety and disaster risk reduction perspective, then the education at school is to be relevant to the natural disasters that the community faces. Next slide. Now here we see the natural hazards experienced by participants in the previous 3 years. This isn't global data like MDAT, this is lived experience. We see that extreme heat is the largest, then bushfire and severe storm. Now, if we jump back to the previous slide, please, you'll see that extreme heat is down below at 42% and severe storms at 37%, though bushfire seems in a reasonable position up near the top. Now, jumping forward again to the original slide, we see a disconnect in what students are learning about at school and the disasters they experience. Like, if I think back to my schooling, and thankfully that wasn't too long ago, I don't remember at all learning the dangers of extreme heat. It was only in uni when the potential damage of the hazard was revealed to me. And this slide brings home the fact that young people consider it important to learn about preparation. In the top left there at 73%. But then in the bottom right, only 45% of people actually were taught preparation skills. Now, as a STEM student, I know how cool it can be to learn about the causes of natural hazards. But the fact is that in a disaster situation like a bushfire, is it good to know that fires move faster uphill? Or is it better to know where to go for help and how to protect oneself and others you care about? Schools and education can play a greater role in disaster resilience if their teaching is in line with the hazards faced by their students and communities. Next. Now this slide here about natural hazard education out of school is also interesting. So unsurprisingly, there's plenty of internet and social media use going on, whereas younger participants approached families and carers. Now, next thing, more young people are learning from television or streaming services than they are from fire or emergency services organizations about disasters and natural hazards. It's close though. For me, I found that surprising considering the key role that emergency services play in coping capacity. Additionally, younger people aged 10 to 15 were more likely to learn from TV at 55% than older participants aged 19 to 25 at 42%. This is concerning as accurate local education is key, and you probably won't find that on Netflix or the news, but you will get it from schools and emergency services. Slide. So what role could government, including local government, play in this? The top three, making sure emergency evacuation centres are known and accessible to everyone. To continue essential services. And third, to understand hazards and actions in their community. I know that 2 of those 3 fall in the field of community education, and that young people do not see themselves as particularly vulnerable, with great care for the homeless and wanting ways to help the community. Youth and young adults don't see themselves as a burden. They want to be part of the solution, and local community education could be a great opportunity for that to emerge. I'll now pass over to Natalie to talk a bit more about the findings regarding climate change and youth political engagement. Next slide.
Hi, so as Ashley was saying, young people are quite educated about climate change, but not necessarily the things that impact them personally and the natural disasters that we're starting to see emerging as a result of climate change. And on this slide, we see what young people's primary concerns were regarding climate change. And we can see that those actually extend, even though I suppose there is a representation of natural disasters and concern for personal welfare, much more so what we see is a concern for all the other facets of climate change. And we see that the livability of our planet, understandably, close to 80% of respondents said that that was one of the things that they were most concerned about. And I think that also extends really well to the extinction of plants and animals and the recognition that all these various aspects of climate change, air pollution, increased temperatures, work together as part of this sort of continuous biosphere. And in some of the other parts of the survey, what else we saw was that among young people, and perhaps even more so than older audiences, we see this very sharp recognition of the fact that climate change is inevitably going to lead to more natural disasters. And so I think young people, and what really emerges from this survey is that young people are concerned by all of these aspects, and that it's very difficult to isolate individual effects themselves. Next slide, please. So on this one, what would young people like the Australian government to do to address the impacts of climate change? Now, I think this one is really interesting, and I think part of the reason for that is that we see that young people, and in particular what young people think the government should be doing, is actually very tied to what scientists think the government should be doing. We know that roughly 1/3 of our annual emissions come from the energy sector, and very easily we see that young people have rated transitioning from fossil fuels as the #1 thing we could be doing to address climate change. And so I think that's really interesting, and I think that's also really positive because it reflects that young people have quite a high understanding, but also knowledge about climate change and what we should be doing about it, and that that's just not necessarily being reflected. Next slide, please. So in terms of young people's knowledge about what they could do, we talked about some of the frameworks for disaster risk reduction earlier. I think that it's perhaps unsurprising that the thing that young people have heard the most about is really school strikes for climate. And when looking at, I suppose, age demarcated data on that, it was easily kind of 15 to 19-year-olds that knew the most about this. But in saying that, school strikes are represented as the thing that young people knew the most about. Nearly half of all respondents knew about the school strikes. And far less knew about things like the United Nations disaster risk reduction frameworks, or other frameworks that are actually very integral to government responses to climate change and to setting nationally determined contributions to things like the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So, and this one gets really interesting as well. And I think this gets really interesting when we look at it in light of the previous slides, is that young people have said that perhaps the most important thing we should be doing is transitioning away from fossil fuels. And we know that also that a lot of young people know about the school strikes. And yet here on this graph, we see that attending a school strike for climate is actually one of the lowest things that young people have done. At about just over probably about 17% of young people have attended a school strike, which is still quite an impressive figure, I suppose, but it's also much less than some of the other responses like the water bottles, reusable water bottles and coffee cups. And what we do see as well is the recognition that emerges from this data that young people see climate change as not just a thing that governments should be addressing, but also something that they should be addressing in their own lives. And I think young people's willingness to take on part of the collective burden of responding to climate change in terms of changing their own consumption behavior and increasing their public transport usage, and being more sustainable from a personal perspective, changing their diet even, I think we see that that's a thing that young people are actually very willing to do, that they recognize that this is going to be, I suppose, a collective response to climate change, and it's going to require the actions of every individual. Next slide, please. So in saying that, what we do see is that overwhelmingly, young people actually don't feel listened to about their views. And that's despite young people actually having a very high awareness about climate change and about the impacts of climate change and what we should be doing. And I think that we see that overwhelmingly in governments, with just 2% of young people feeling like their views are consistently listened to by government, which I think is really quite shocking. That's down from 37% who feel listened to by their parents, which is hopeful, but definitely we want to be having those higher numbers across sectors as well. And I think that actually perhaps explains some of the results we saw earlier, that despite young people, like 50% easily of young people knowing about school strikes, 17% actually going. And what I think that reflects, and what I've, I suppose, personally seen, is this move towards an increasingly individualistic response to climate change, perhaps, that people feel like they're not being listened to necessarily. And so young people are just doing what they can, and that's things like switching to reusable water bottles, even when perhaps going to protests or lobbying governments might actually have a greater impact on climate change. And I think that just speaks to the fact that young people don't feel listened to when they do those things, and so are opting for behaviours that perhaps have less impact, but perhaps are more within the control of the individual. Next slide, please. So we'll just have Ashley reading out some of the responses again from young people that commented on the survey.
A 21-year-old from Melbourne said, "The Australian government plays a pivotal role in supporting each and every resident of this country, and to make sure that everyone's protected from whatever danger that is approaching. Therefore, we put a lot of hopes in the government to initiate any action necessary for the sake of climate change and for the future." And a 13-year-old from Adelaide, "Governments don't have the answers, the scientists do. And young people want the government to hear what is being said. Listen to the Indigenous Australian communities, listen to the scientists, take on their advice, be determined and driven to make each Australian living eco-friendly lives. Work towards introducing new legislation and use renewable energy to reduce the effects of climate change. Consult with children regularly and ensure they are doing well mentally with the natural hazards coming." And so this kind of brings us to a close. So just to summarize, young people are concerned about climate change and don't believe we are doing enough. They've experienced natural hazards personally and feel that disasters present a real and personal threat to their lives and prospects. They feel underprepared by schools for the disasters they face and are turning to the internet and social media for information. Young Australians do not feel listened to by the governments, but their parents are listening. And young Australians want the Australian government to listen to scientists' advice on climate change and transition from fossil fuels to clean and renewable energy. Thank you very much for listening all, and let's bring on the Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation and such important research. There's just so much wisdom in young people that we really need to listen to, and that just made it, so much more clear. So we have received some Q&A, some questions. So I'm now going to turn to some of these. And if you have any and you haven't entered them into the Q&A function, please do so. So a couple of kind of logistical questions. We have a question that is about the actual survey itself and how the decision was made to identify young people as aged 10 to 15 years. Do you have any answers to that? Was there a specific reason why you chose that age bracket?
So, Will from World Vision here. The survey was of young people aged 10 to 24 years. And the reason why we went with that is because that's a commonly used definition of young people. While we're interested in the views of children, the reality is that children and young people have sort of very connected views and interests on these issues. And so the 1,447 young people that we had take the online survey, they were a good mix of ages between 10 and 24. And we worked with the survey company to make sure that there was a good representation of regional and urban communities there as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Will. So I've got a few questions here from Margaret Morton. They're probably around the reason why you did the survey in the first place. So do you have any ideas or suggestions that you can provide to people who are listening about, how do we get people to take young people more seriously? How do we get people to listen to young people? And how do we get the government to listen to young people? Any of you feel free to jump in.
I'm just going to kind of bridge between that previous question and this one, so someone else on the panel can get ready to answer that a bit better. But I just want to say as well, there have been a few questions about the survey going down as young as 10 years old. And I just think it concerns me a little bit that people are perhaps dismissive of children as young as 10. But if you've got any children yourself, or if you've taught in a primary school, 10-year-olds and 11 and 12-year-olds in upper primary school can be quite articulate and deep thinking as well around big issues. So I think sometimes people might want to have a little think about what they know of young people before they make decisions, I guess, about what they're capable of contributing.
Thanks, Brigid.
And I'm happy to speak to that one a little bit. I suppose that Look, I think it's extremely difficult, and I think if young people had the answers, hopefully would do something about it. Unfortunately, at least in my experience, I've found that most of getting people to listen to me is usually about having some positions of power and influence that is entirely distinct from my age. And I think that at least my experience has been that as soon as people are aware of my age, they take me much less seriously. And I think that's kind of an unfortunate reality that we see that's also, I suppose, not actually backed up by fact. And I think we see in this survey as well that young people are actually very well informed about these things. And I suppose I'm also the ACT director of Oaktree, which is Australia's largest youth-run international development organisation. And I think working with young people, you really see how articulate young people are and how knowledgeable they are. And I think that one of the pathways for getting young people listened to is really through having these sorts of youth-led organizations. And I think that we have managed to, I suppose, accomplish so much through that. And even, I suppose, myself in my own experiences with Oaktree, I'm convening a panel with 7 federal politicians later this year. And I've only been able to do that because of being on a youth-run organization. And so I think it's about having this collaboration between individuals, between young people, and the formalization of that can really help young voices to be projected.
Excellent. Thanks, Natalie. And I think, some of the data that you presented on the number of young people that are impacted by disasters, but, that startling statistic that only 2% of young people actually feel heard, that really struck a chord with me. Now, look, I've got a question here from Leah Mund, who says thank you, first of all, and a question about schools. So how can schools link their efforts in the classroom to young people's priorities and their interest in social media and live streaming platforms for information and communications? I'll stop there. There's a second part, but I'll stop there for the moment.
I'm going to jump in just for a second there, just to direct people to the AIDR Education for Young People program if they're not aware of it already. You can find that on the AIDR website. We've had our network meeting this morning, and there's definitely a lot of great examples of where schools are working in partnership with emergency services and others to deliver really good place-based, local risk-focused education that really fits in with what we saw coming out of this survey. So we have a lot of information there that I'll pass to anyone else who'd like to add on.
Excellent, and thanks, Brigid. That link has just been posted in the chat, so please go to that for those resources. Maybe I'll just go to the second part of that question. So how can emergency services creating resources for schools better respond to youth priorities and utilise these platforms? Any ideas?
So, yeah, I see how that follows a little bit more, and I didn't answer that in the previous question, but when we're talking or young people accessing social media or internet information about hazards or disasters and climate change, from an emergency services point of view, I think it's about considering young people as part of your general community engagement. So what is the information that you put out to the general community through your websites and through your social media that, is it accessible to a younger audience? Are you helping young people make that direct contact with your organisation when they're doing their research?
Thanks, Brigid. And I might just 2 more questions. So this one's from Maddie, and Maddie is a young person, yay. And she's wondering if you have any comments about mental and emotional resilience for young people who are experiencing climate anxiety and grief.
I can go to this, and I suppose Ashley can tack on if he has anything he'd like to add. I think I've definitely felt this, and I think I've spent my life feeling this. And I think that, I suppose when I was a teenager, what I was really, really struggling with was deciding upon a career path. And for me, I felt like climate change is the greatest kind of existential threat of my generation. And I felt like I needed to do everything I possibly could to kind of alleviate that dread. And for me, that was deciding to devote my career to climate change and to environmental policy making. But I would say, broadly speaking, recognizing that nobody has the answers, but recognizing that everybody wants to help is something that's really important, and understanding the importance of peer-to-peer networks and of other people, and the, I suppose, collective action and the extent to which that can actually produce really meaningful outcomes. And I would say, as much as possible, focus on outcomes, and focus on doing as much as you can in the ways and in the communities that you can, because I think it becomes very easy to kind of sit back and get really upset about things. And I think feeling like you're a part of something, feeling like you're contributing, and at the end of the day, even if you don't succeed, being able to say, I did everything that I could. And I think that's really important, to still feel like you have some sort of an action, some sort of initiative, and some sort of stake in this. Can be really important from, I would say, a personal sustainability and mental health perspective.
Yeah, that is awesome stuff. Thanks, Natalie. I'd also say, like, something which kind of makes sense to me is that climate anxiety can somewhat be similar to anxiety about work. Also, you don't feel any better by just like leaving a task and like delaying it. You can relieve some stress by taking action on it and feeling like you've done your best. And that's something that I think anybody with a due date can relate to. And so it's important to feel involved with the movement to make sure you feel like your voice is being heard. So I'd encourage that. The second point is about the youth views presentation, which was shared during the Dranson session earlier this morning, which is absolutely brilliant resource for exactly that, about mental health and resilience, and helping young people to cope through natural hazards. And so I'd refer to the great work that they're doing at Uni Melb too.
Excellent, thank you. And I think they're really wise words about the fact that action is often one of the best ways to shift those feelings of disempowerment. So thank you. So look, just finally, and then we're going to move on to the next session. So given that, in the audience, we have a whole lot of people here that are practicing disaster resilience in its many different forms, some people forming policy, some people undertaking community engagement activities and everything else. So given your experience, what is some advice that you would provide the people listening here today to better engage youth in these sorts of conversations?
I'll go first, and I really hope that all of you that were keen to engage youth more in disaster risk reduction were able to get along to the Dranson session this morning. I found that incredibly enlightening and encouraging. The fact, like, there's so many different projects which are going on in like different pockets of the nation with it's almost like different microcosms, and so there's so much that you can learn from each other's different ways of going about things, from a bit more of a traditional local government model through to like co-design from NGOs. So having a look at the resources from the Dranson session this morning, learn from one another, because you're all brilliant, and so like just value the experience and knowledge of one another, and recognize, like, because yeah, there's a bunch of already great work being done about youth in disaster risk reduction.
I would also just like to quickly add that I think even how this survey was undertaken presents a really great model of youth participation, because I think not only was it asking young people about their opinions, but I think every step of this process, in terms of having a panel of youth that were invited to help analyze the results and prepare the report, I think it's that is really important. And I think that shows to young people that their voices aren't necessarily just a tokenistic thing, but they're also, I suppose, consulted with, and their opinion is actually held to be meaningful. And so I think this process itself was actually quite a good model for future youth engagement moving forward.
Fantastic.
And I know that after we'd done those workshops, and I was speaking to Will afterwards, and we were both like, yeah, great, let's do it again.
Yeah, we were definitely blown away, and would repeat this 1,000 times over. So if you have a project and there's a space for young people to engage, then just like find some and talk to them, because they'll be more insightful than maybe you were expecting. But from a World Vision perspective, as a child rights organization, we think about an issue like feminism and women's participation, and it's not just something that can be solved with a one-off tokenistic engagement. It's actually structural, and child rights engagement has to be structural as well. It's a lens that you have to see everything through. Every issue has an impact on children, and children should have an ability to engage on every issue. And so what are the structures within our organizations that can facilitate that? What are the things that are blocking young people's participation? And how can you yourself be a champion? Because not everyone sees the world through a feminist lens. A lot of women have brought that lens into workplaces and been responsible for progress there. There are very few under 18-year-old people in our workplaces. And so there has to be somebody who has that lens, who's not a child themselves. And so for us to be the champions, I think would be a great start.
Fantastic. And I think that that is an excellent note to end on. So look, thank you so much, Natalie, Ashley, Brigid, and Will. That was a fantastic presentation, really insightful, and also such an important message. So thank you.